Good evening, and thank you for coming to the last of this year's activities sponsored by the Martin Luther King Day Committee. I would like to thank President Dennison for sponsoring all of the activities, and thank members of the Martin Luther King Day Committee, particularly Jeff Wiltsey, who was above and beyond the call of duty in his efforts this year. I also need to thank the Organization of American Historians Speakers Bureau, under whose auspices our speaker is here tonight. And I think that concludes all the thank yous. As we conclude our activities for marking the Martin Luther King Day holiday, and as we look forward to Black History Month in February, I think we're very lucky tonight to have in A. Philip Randolph, one of the most appropriate topics you really could have for Martin Luther King Day activities, and in Eric Arneson, we couldn't have a more appropriate speaker. Eric Arneson earned his bachelor's from Wesleyan University in 1980. He has master's in history and Afro-American studies from Yale University in 1984, and earned his PhD in history from Yale in 1986. He's taught at Yale and Harvard, and since 1992 has been at the University of Illinois at Chicago. He became a full professor of history and African American studies there in 2000, and he's the author of many books and countless articles. Actually, I guess you could count them, but I didn't. It took 10 pages to list them, so I didn't count them. Professor Arneson has won awards for his scholarship, for his teaching, but I think two of his books in particular have had an enormous impact on the historical profession's understanding of black labor. One is called Waterfront Workers of New Orleans, Race, Class, and Politics, 1863 to 1923, which was published in 1991. It's a history of relations between black and white waterfront unions. That story is told against a beautifully drawn backdrop of social and economic and political changes in New Orleans, and not just New Orleans, but the larger nation as well, from the Civil War to the early 1920s. It describes cooperation between black and white waterfront workers in the 1880s, which was dashed in the 1890s by economic depression, by racism, and by the attempts of employers to pit black and white workers against each other. But he doesn't end his story there. As the economy rebounded, there was yet another attempt at interracial cooperation. And as Professor Arneson writes, the racial practices of the dock unions constituted the most conspicuous exception to segregation and racial exclusion in New Orleans. But racial tensions increased after World War I, and in 1923 the unions were pretty resoundingly defeated. Professor Arneson argues that the defeat of the dock workers ultimately came not so much from internal problems, but from external forces. The drive for open shops and changes in the workplace, some of it technological. The second book that's really, I would love to call to your attention, is Brotherhoods of Color, Black Railroad Workers and the Struggle for Equality. That came out in 2001, and it's a history of black railroad workers from the antebellum era through the modern era. The concentration of black workers on the railroads as porters symbolized a hardening of segregation and Jim Crow in the railroad industry. And that pattern of discrimination endured, with a few exceptions, right up to the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century. As he did with the waterfront workers, Professor Arneson put that story in a larger context. He demonstrated how the persistence of racial barriers in the railroad industry resulted from an interplay of forces, particularly the discriminatory policies of employers, rank-and-file workers, racist unions, and government policy. His lucid and forceful prose makes his books and articles a pleasure to read. And he's now working on book on one of the most important black leaders and black labor leaders of the 20th century, an under-recognized figure, A. Philip Randolph. Randolph founded the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which became one of the most important black institutions in America in the years, the decades before the Brown decision of 1954. After World War II broke out, and the United States began to arm itself in case it became involved in that war, many Americans found work in defense industries. But discrimination banned black workers from many of those jobs. In 1941, Randolph organized, or threatened to organize, a march on Washington in protest of this situation. And that pressure convinced Franklin Roosevelt to establish a Fair Employment Practices Commission, which was basically a toothless tiger, but it was an important step. More than 2 decades later, Randolph's vision of a march on Washington became a reality when he was one of the principal organizers of a march on Washington in 1963, in which Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. So it seems entirely appropriate to mark Martin Luther King Day by listening to a talk about an important African American leader whose career in many ways set up and paved the way for Martin Luther King. And I think there's virtually no one we could find better qualified to talk on that subject than Professor Arneson. His title tonight is The Legacies of A. Philip Randolph, Civil Rights, Labor, and the New Black Politics. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Professor Eric Arneson.
Thank you, Mike, for that very, perhaps overly generous introduction. It is an honor to be with you this evening to talk with you and to commemorate the holiday honoring Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I certainly don't have to tell you that Dr. King is perhaps the most well-known African-American civil rights leader of modern years. Other than Frederick Douglass, perhaps no other black activist has as much name recognition as King. His birthday is a national holiday. He is subject to numerous biographies, as well as the protagonist of countless studies of the modern civil rights era. And his heroic efforts have been immortalized in documentary films that we've seen on public television and in many of our classrooms. I would not hesitate to say that our current interest in Dr. King is appropriate and healthy for our society. For all of the racial inequities that remain with us today, I think there is no question that the modern civil rights movement radically and profoundly transformed this nation. The America that we find ourselves in the year 2008, is a profoundly different place from the one Dr. King and the movement struggled to transform in the years from 1955, when King led the Montgomery bus boycott, to 1968, when King was assassinated. The modern civil rights movement overturned the legal foundations of Jim Crow, a system of racial subordination that relegated African Americans to a subordinate place in the country's economy and society, that denied to them the right to vote and kept them confined to supposedly separate but equal, but in reality separate and unequal facilities. By the late 1960s, legalized segregation was destroyed. Southern African Americans had won the right to vote, and they entered the political process in vast numbers. 40 years after the famous March on Washington of '63, best remembered for King's often replayed "I Have a Dream" speech, the United States is in many ways a different and far better country. And Dr. King is credited by many a public school history book, by our politicians, and by our media with helping to bring about that different and better America. Now, my purpose tonight is not to revisit the familiar King legacy, but to use the commemoration occasion to reflect upon the broader history of the civil rights movement, and particularly its antecedents, by examining the life and legacy of an earlier activist, A. Philip Randolph. I want to begin then with a familiar, well-known moment, one whose image we often see this time of year in February during Black History Month in particular, the famous '63 March on Washington. Roughly 250,000 Americans gathered on the Mall in Washington, D.C. before the Lincoln Memorial on August 28, 1963, in a protest calling for jobs and freedom. This was the single largest demonstration in American history to that point in time. It attracted African Americans and whites, civil rights activists, trade unionists, and liberal supporters of black equality. The march, as we all well know, subsequently became enshrined in America's historical consciousness, and understandably so, for it was on that day, on that occasion, that King delivered his memorable "I Have a Dream" speech. But historical memory has a way of being, well, incomplete or playing tricks upon us. So what do we remember about the march? That it was about King's dream, and it was about black freedom, a sweeping term that embraced the demands for an end to segregation and all forms of Jim Crow on the one hand, and for genuine equality before the law on the other. But that's not all the march was about. The other half of the march slogan, jobs, has been conveniently forgotten. For some of the march's organizers, jobs and freedom were inextricably linked. Also on that stage, on that hot August day, was the dean, the elder statesman of black activism, A. Philip Randolph, for whom the march was a culmination of almost a half-century of personal political struggle for black equality. Randolph had proposed a Washington demonstration, a jobs rights march and mobilization, as he called it, to focus on black unemployment, inferior education, and the need for federal solutions to black economic inequality. Joining forces with King, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, the National Urban League, and various other civil rights groups, the organization of the march focused on the broad notion of jobs and freedom. We are in the advance guard of a massive moral revolution, Randolph declared before the assembled crowd on that day in '63. This civil rights revolution is not confined to the Negro, nor is it confined to civil rights. We know we have no future in a society in which 6 million black and white people are unemployed and millions live in poverty. We want a free, democratic society dedicated to the political, economic, and social advancement. It falls to us to demand full employment, and to put automation at the service of human needs, not at the service of profit, end quote. As it turned out, by the end of his life, King also came to embrace Randolph's emphasis on jobs and economic equality as central to the civil rights cause. Some have argued that he embraced it even earlier. Ultimately, though, Randolph's agenda would only be partially realized. Laws against racial segregation, legal segregation, would fall soon, but the broader social democratic vision of economic equality for all Americans, black and white, would not come to pass. A consideration of the life of A. Philip Randolph presents something of a challenge to the dominant popular narrative and interpretation of the modern civil rights movement, a challenge that I would ask you to think about this evening. I want to start with the most basic of issues: origins and timing. In the standard accounts and in popular imagination, the civil rights movement begins when? In the mid-1950s, particularly with the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955-56, or just after the Supreme Court decision against segregation in its landmark case Brown v. Board of Education in '54. Much of what we remember about the civil rights movement comes from the wonderful documentary series Eyes on the Prize, first broadcast in the 1980s. Though when I recently asked my students how many of them had seen this, assuming that they had all been exposed to it in junior high school or high school, I got this blank look on their face, much to my shock and horror. It's a series that deserves to be watched again and again. But as for Eyes on the Prize, what the program offers us is what we call in the history biz the Montgomery to Memphis narrative, which on one level, I'd suggest, is solid, but on another level is misleading. For the movement didn't simply spring out of nothing. It grew and drew upon a rich and long tradition of civil rights activism in both North and South. Over the past several decades, historians have been substantially revising our understanding of the origins of the modern civil rights movement. Those examining civil rights have located its origins, its roots, in the activities of countless activists in the 1940s, some even say the 1930s. Some of the names of figures we now study and talk about extensively may be familiar to you, others less so. Randolph is but one. Bayard Rustin, Ella Baker, Charles Hamilton Houston, just to name a few, are others. If one reads the academic literature today, it's hard to miss the paradigm shift. Yeah, something new emerged in 1955 or so, following the Brown decision and extending beyond the Montgomery bus boycott. But the modern movement had a history, a prehistory, and was in many ways a continuation of struggles that predated by at least a decade or more. And today, historians evoke the concept of the long civil rights movement, that's a phrase we now employ regularly, to capture the history of the movement before the movement, that is, before its classical Montgomery to Memphis stage, a movement in its own right that cannot simply be reduced to that of prelude or seed time for what was to follow. My friend, historian Kevin Boyle, has observed that, quote, increasingly historians have come to see the dramatic events of 1954 to 68, not as the story of civil rights, he says, but as one part of a battle that raged through much of the 20th century, with the long civil rights movement beginning in at least the 1930s. One of the most prominent proponents of this notion of a long civil rights movement, Jacqueline Dowd Hall, has insisted that this notion of the long movement that took root in the liberal or radical milieu of the 30s is, quote, more robust, more progressive, and more true a story of civil rights. Whatever the merits of these claims, and there's still a lot of room for discussion and debate about them, it seems pretty clear to me that this scholarship has deeply enriched our understandings of various political currents and struggles that lay largely invisible or at least below the radar screen for many years. The story is no longer one of a tired Rosa Parks inadvertently launching a movement by her courageous refusal to give up a seat on a segregated bus, or of a young, unknown preacher named King emerging into national prominence through his leadership of the Montgomery movement. Randolph is a key figure, and I, as a biographer of Randolph, would go so far as to call him the key figure in this long civil rights movement. He was arguably the most important black labor leader and civil rights activist in the United States in the mid-20th century. And at least many of his contemporaries from the mid-30s through 50s, they thought so. He was, in the words of the black weekly The Minneapolis Spokesman from 1942, quote, the biggest Negro in America and perhaps the entire civilized world. Civilized, quote unquote, world. The following year, a black journalist called him the race's foremost leader. Over a decade later, a white journalist perceived Randolph as, quote, the unquestioned #1 leader of the nation's 17 million Negroes, a figure who has been hailed at times as the greatest leader of his race since Frederick Douglass, unquote. By mid-century, Randolph's over 3 decades in politics included his opposition to American involvement in World War I, editing a remarkable and iconoclastic journal, radical journal, The Messenger, advocating on behalf of the Socialist Party, leading the fledgling Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters to a major Union victory, forcing President Franklin Roosevelt to create a federal Fair Employment Practice Committee, and forcing Harry Truman, president, to begin desegregating the armed forces. Randolph insisted upon linking racial and class issues in his analysis of African Americans' plight and strategies for social change, while cultivating a new and more confrontational political sensibility among African Americans. Randolph lived a long and genuinely interesting life, at least from the perspective of his biographer. Now, my purpose in writing about that life is not to put Randolph on a pedestal. We tend to do this with historical figures, especially those we have sympathy for. My purpose is not to render him a useful figure for our times. Personally, I am fascinated by his intellectual and political evolution, by the organizational and ideological choices that he made, and by his impact on the shape of black protest movements and American politics. And in writing his biography today, I hope to extend our understanding of the civil rights movement, its origins, its strategies, its goals, significantly pushing it back in time to demonstrate both the continuities and discontinuities with the modern movement. I want to start talking about Randolph by beginning where biographies often do, childhood. Asa, as he was called in his youth, was born in Florida in 1889, almost a quarter of a century after the nation's Civil War dealt chattel slavery a death blow. He was the son of a self-educated, poor itinerant minister of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, James Randolph, and his wife, Elizabeth Robinson Randolph. Asa and his brother James grew up in a household that, while short on material possessions, they were dirt poor, placed great importance on matters spiritual and educational. By his own telling, among the most fundamental forces that shaped his life were, quote, rigid Christian parental guidance and discipline in a humble though stable home, unquote. His deeply religious parents, he recalled in 1944, gave me a sense of the meaning and power of moral values, responsibilities and loyalties, and I believe a certain spiritual insight that have helped to direct my feet towards, if not in the path of the right, as I have been able to see it and understand it, unquote. Randolph may later have criticized the black church for its conservatism, but he could hardly escape its influence over his rhetorical strategies and his personal moral framework. However much he viewed himself as an atheist, his years growing up as the son of an AME minister in a devoutly Christian home structured his moral universe, imprinting on him a sense of rectitude and righteous indignation that sustained him in his repeated uphill political battles with those who would uphold injustice or otherwise lead America astray. The Randolph household in the 1890s and the early 20th century inculcated two enduring traits in Asa. The first was a passionate commitment to education. And I can't underscore this enough. Asa and his brother absorbed an abiding passion for reading, learning, and intellectual engagement that distinguished them throughout their teenage years. Both made extensive use of the segregated library in Jacksonville, Florida, and they pestered their father to buy them books from old bookstores. The dominant culture climate of the home was ideas, Randolph later recounted. Asa and his brother James would engage in, quote, intellectual gymnastics and intellectual entertainment by debating at length the existence of God. These intellectualities, as Asa termed them, could engage the Randolph boys for, quote, hours, sometimes days, unquote. The second trait was an active interest in racial politics. The Reverend James Randolph required the boys' presence at AME annual conferences when they took place in Jacksonville. Asa recalled being impressed by the bishop's organizing abilities and their outspoken politics. To their credit, he recalled, during the years of bitter and violent racial hatred against the Negro, church leaders spoke out from the pulpit in the Deep South against Jim Crow and lynch laws. Similarly inspirational were their reverends' current events and history lectures, delivered to his sons at the kitchen table, on the porch, or before the fireplace. Passionately devoted to the race, in Randolph's words, he instilled in his children a deep sense of racial pride through his interpretation of black history. The Reverend James, quote, drilled into us the idea that there was nothing beyond you if you studied to equip yourself, he recalled. His parents also nurtured a firm belief in equality and the possibilities of individual achievement despite racial oppression. Well, the world of Jacksonville, Florida, that Asa grew up in held few opportunities to African Americans who aspired to more than manual labor. Like a small but growing number of ambitious young men and women, Asa joined the migrant stream that was steadily carrying the South's so-called talented tenth to a region that would soon be called a land of hope. At the age of 22, Asa made New York City his home in 1911. He encountered a restricted job market in which black men and women were relegated to menial, unskilled work. And for a number of years, Randolph maneuvered through this low-wage common labor market, maintaining what one observer called the, quote, hand-to-mouth existence so common to Negro migrants, of this period, unquote. Randolph kept few jobs for long, barely eking out a living. Yet New York City in the 1910s was a dynamic and challenging place, and the rapid relocation of Manhattan's black population north to Harlem was in the process of transforming that community into what would soon be viewed as the Negro Mecca, the vibrant cultural capital of black America. The city and the community captured Randolph's imagination and allowed him to pursue his intellectual and political interests. While working odd jobs, he took acting, singing, and elocution lessons, gave public dramatic readings, and performed in a number of Shakespearean theatrical productions. He was blocked in his choice of vocation in the theater by his parents' firm opposition, so he channeled his energies into another avenue over which apparently his parents had little say: socialism. He immersed himself in the extensive intellectual world of radical New York. He took inexpensive evening courses and lectures at New York City's City College. He took courses at the socialist-leaning Rand School of Social Science. He went to the New York Public Library. He studied economics, sociology, and history. And it was in this interracial intellectual milieu that he first encountered the arguments of socialist thinkers, and he studied the history of the workers' movement in Europe. And according to his biographer Jervis Anderson, Randolph was so excited by the discovery of the left that, quote, in his spare time he began reading Marx as children read Alice in Wonderland, unquote. Randolph's growing political radicalism was fueled by his course of study, the stream of socialists, labor leaders, and black activists whose lectures he attended, and his participation in the world of soapbox oratory, street speaking, and discussion that engaged considerable energies on the part of radicals and African Americans. In 1916, he joined the Socialist Party and was ready to step out into the political spotlight as an independent thinker in his own right. Joining forces with Chandler Owen, a Southern black expatriate, Randolph launched the self-consciously radical magazine, The Messenger, a monthly that promoted black equality, labor radicalism, and of course, socialism. This in the year 1917. And from the pages of this amazing magazine, Randolph eloquently and passionately castigated white America for lynchings, peonage, race riots, segregation, the activities of the Ku Klux Klan, and the denial of basic rights to black Americans. African American leaders, too, received relentless verbal drubbings as the editors took to task black Republicans for their conservatism and their timidity. They took to task black civil rights leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois for their moderation, and took on black radicals like Marcus Garvey for what they saw as their narrow nationalism. But the Messenger didn't stop with an analysis of the shortcomings of America's racial politics. Its pages offered extensive critiques of the failings of American capitalism: unemployment, low wages, poverty, corporate anti-unionism, workers' lack of basic rights, the suppression of radical trade unions by the government. All of these received scathing coverage. Accordingly, Randolph urged black workers to unionize. He advocated the cooperation of black and white labor, supported the radical industrial workers of the world, and promoted a broader struggle against the nation's political and economic system, which he believed rested upon the subordination of both African American and the nation's white working class. For his opposition to the U.S. involvement in World War I, he and Owen called on blacks to avoid conscription and instead to, quote, make America unsafe for hypocrisy. He was arrested, but not convicted, under the Espionage Act, and the Messenger was temporarily banned from the mails. To Justice Department officials, Randolph had become, quote, the most dangerous Negro in America, unquote. However great his passion and his eloquence, Randolph had little to show for his efforts by the early 1920s. Race relations in the United States had gone from bad to worse following the signing of the armistice ending the war in late 1918. By the summer of 1919, the number of lynchings had increased. Savage race riots had broken out across the country. The American socialist movement was itself in sharp retreat, having suffered from tremendous government repression during the war, as well as from its own internal splits and defections, while the American Federation of Labor lost most of its new members that it had gained during the war and went down to defeat in a series of bloody strikes, both titanic and small, between 1919 and 1922-23. The radical IWW, which had advocated interracial industrial unionism, lay in shambles, while the AFL's doors remained quite shut to black members, rendering Randolph's hope of an interracial working-class alliance very elusive. Large numbers of black Americans found the message of Garvey's Nationalist Universal Negro Improvement Association or the Civil Rights Program of the NAACP far more attractive than Randolph's message of socialism, working-class unity, and black equality. The messenger survived, barely, but remained plagued by financial problems into the 20s. Randolph's palpable impatience with the racial status quo and his aggressive pursuit of change reflected and influenced the emergence of a new mood of growing numbers of black Americans, symbolized by the visibility of the so-called New Negro of the World War I years and the 1920s, yet Randolph remained a public figure without a movement, an exhorter with few followers. All that changed rapidly in 1925, when a small group of veteran Pullman porters approached Randolph about assuming the leadership of a new union, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Since the year 1867, the Pullman Company had provided long-distance traveling public with luxury railway palace cars, hotels on wheels, luxury service through the employment of a small army of Pullman porters. Black men whose job it was to keep Pullman sleeping cars clean and well-stocked with necessities, to lower and raise sleeping berths, to clean riders' shoes, and to otherwise cater to white passengers' whims. The Pullman Company capitalized on popular white associations of race and servility, for only blacks would be hired as porters. With much of the skilled job market closed to blacks because of their race, portering was for many an attractive alternative. In their communities, porters were often seen as civic pillars, as labor aristocrats. Relatively low wages compelled them to work very hard for tips, and their work was also exhausting. But whatever the job's drawbacks, black men sought out portering jobs, which held out the opportunity of stable employment and the chance to see much of the country. Those seeking to unionize Pullman porters in the 20s had an uphill fight ahead of them. With roughly 12,000 blacks on its payroll by World War I, the Pullman Company was the single largest employer of black labor in the United States, a fact that neither the company nor black supporters failed to point out on every possible occasion. Generous financial contributions to black hospitals, YMCAs, churches, and social clubs ensured that many black local leaders would repay Pullman's paternalism by coming to the company's defense and denouncing any challenge to its authority or reputation. The question of how to compel the Pullman Company to recognize and to bargain with its workers' bona fide union perplexed and stymied the newly formed BSCP, the Brotherhood, from its inception well into the 1930s. Randolph had a reputation as a powerful street speaker. He was a passionate journalist and a committed activist. These traits made him attractive to the handful of men seeking to build the Brotherhood. Randolph placed the Messenger at the porter's disposal. He used its pages to critique the Pullman Company to make the case for the union. Ignoring the porters' high standing in their own communities, Randolph and his organizers portrayed the porters as virtual slaves, forced by low wages to engage in obsequious behavior before whites to solicit tips. The companies had deprived the porters of their manhood, they charged. The company union was a farce, offering no protection to its workers. The company's sponsorship of the performing porters' quartets made porters, quote, the monkeys of the service, unquote. The union's goal included recognition, a living wage, shorter hours, compensation for all hours worked, including previously unpaid preparatory time, respect for seniority, a legitimate grievance procedure that ensured fairness, and the rehiring of all porters fired for their union activity. Above all, The quest for racial dignity lay at the heart of the Porters' campaign for a union. The old Pullman porter, Randolph declared, was often an Uncle Tom, suffering from a slave psychology, who would bow and lick the boots of the company officials. The old porter was characterized by fear to think, to speak, or to act. The Brotherhood championed a new porter who would stand tall and proud. Porters and maids have changed, Randolph insisted, just as the entire Negro race has changed. The new porter's creed was independence without insolence, courtesy without fawning, service without civility, opportunity without alms. Only through organization and by joining the Brotherhood could Pullman porters put to rest the old porter and ensure the creation of the new. Now, this proved to be no simple matter. From 1925 to 1935, Randolph and his followers, his colleagues, fought an uphill battle against a very powerful Pullman corporation. Pullman unleashed a barrage of hostile attacks against the fledgling union, relying heavily upon ministers, politicians, and journalists, and civic leaders that it had cultivated over the years to condemn the BSCP for its attacks on the benevolent Pullman Company. Equally damaging was the company union and its crackdown through the use of spies and informants involving harassment and the dismissal of declared union supporters. Membership of the union was dropped, and the union was evicted from its office. It was so broke in 1933. And to many outside observers, it looked like the Brotherhood was essentially dead. And yet, it survived and ultimately triumphed. Over the course of the late 20s and early 30s, the Brotherhood reached out to white liberals and the black community and religious leaders, slowly spreading the gospel of black trade unionism. When the BSCP launched its crusade for recognition and dignity in 25, it confronted a black elite that was largely, if not entirely, indifferent or hostile to unions. In the late 20s and early 30s, Randolph and allies cultivated NAACP officials, clergymen, and black women's clubs. More than any other single individual, Randolph contributed to an historic shift of opinion in the black middle class from anti to pro-unionism. With the support and the coming of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal during the Great Depression, the BSCP finally prevailed in 1935, winning a decisive union election overseen by the government. 2 years later, in 1937, it negotiated an unprecedented and path-breaking contract with the Pullman Company that constituted, in Randolph's words, a foundation on which the future of the porters' well-being and a constructive and powerful brotherhood could be built. The porters' victory, Randolph rightly believed, would reverberate beyond the ranks of Pullman employees. It should serve as one of the great stimulants to organization of race workers in all industries throughout the country. The race has the courage, the spirit, and the will to fight for economic freedom and justice like all other workers, unquote. Randolph's high profile and the BSCP's success did in fact inspire numerous groups of black workers to organize. By World War II, hundreds of thousands of African American workers had joined the American labor movement. Randolph did more than inspire and assist black unionists in the 30s and 40s. He helped to forge a new kind of labor organization that fused traditional workplace concerns with a civil rights agenda. From its inception, the BSCP insisted that the struggle for the Porters Union involved the dignity and manhood of its members. The union also turned outward to the community and to political affairs, engaging in a wide range of civil rights issues in the 30s and beyond, including opposition to the Southern poll tax and support for anti-lynching legislation. The union advocated laws mandating fair employment and consumer cooperatives, and sponsored Black History Week celebrations and labor history classes. Randolph joined with disaffected NAACP members and other black radicals, including members of the Communist Party, to establish the National Negro Congress, the NNC, in 1936, to bring together religious, civic, and trade union groups to promote militant grassroots activism, kind of pushing the entire spectrum of black protest to the left and into a more militant stance. Randolph served as president of the NNC through 1940, when he resigned unhappily, quite bitterly, over the increasingly dominant role of the Communist Party. For much of his life, Randolph was a staunch anti-communist. By the late 30s and early 40s, Randolph and BSCP leaders, working in concert with what was called the New Crowd network of black activists, effectively challenged an older black politics based on patronage and civility, and thereby decisively shifted the tone and substance of black protest and organizing. So not surprisingly, by World War II, Randolph was considered to be the foremost leader of black America. I don't think that this is an exaggeration. Events during the early 40s cemented Randolph's reputation as one of the nation's most prominent black leaders, one on whom government officials had to take into account when framing their policies toward African Americans. While Randolph became a hero to growing numbers of black Americans and some white liberals, he increasingly became a thorn in the side of political leaders who sought to balance blacks' demands for racial equality with white conservatives' demands for the maintenance of the racial status quo. And during the tumultuous years of World War II, maintaining that balance proved very difficult. Ultimately, Randolph found his broader goals sacrificed on the altar of wartime efficiency. By the early 40s, the American economy had largely recovered from the hardships of the Depression of the 1930s as the nation's industrial sector geared up for war production. The new prosperity, however, was not equally enjoyed by all Americans. Unemployment rates dropped steadily for white workers, but blacks' access to new jobs lagged far behind. Large numbers of employers refused to hire black workers beyond menial or unskilled positions. Few risked promoting them into skilled jobs, even when the supply of labor was tight. And numerous trade unions remained reluctant to admit blacks or to represent their interests. If employment discrimination was wrong under normal circumstances, it appeared absurd to many in the context of growing labor shortages. Randolph placed these issues squarely and prominently on the national agenda in 1941. When he publicly announced the creation of a March on Washington movement, which aimed at ending discrimination in both wartime production and in the armed forces. He put it this way: if the Negro is shut out of these extensive and intensive changes in industry, labor, and business prompted by the war, the race will be set back over 50 years. We, loyal Negro American citizens, demand the right to work and fight for our country, unquote. To accomplish this end, Randolph proposed initially a march of 10,000 African Americans, a number that was shortly inflated to 100,000, to march in Washington, D.C. to force the hand of Franklin Roosevelt's administration. Thousands would descend upon Washington, D.C. One black paper predicted they will come from the voteless South and the jobless North, united in protest over a way of life which offers neither freedom nor opportunity. They will make articulate the demands of the oppressed people who have been caught in the vice of racial intolerance and economic slavery, unquote. If African Americans could not stop discrimination outright, they could nonetheless, quote, tear the mask of hypocrisy from American democracy, unquote. Fearing political embarrassment and potential disorder and violence in the nation's capital, the Roosevelt administration did everything it could to convince Randolph to cancel the march, but to no avail. Determined to stop the march, Roosevelt finally issued Executive Order 8802 in June of 1941, declaring that there shall be, quote, no discrimination in the employment of workers in the defense industries or government because of race, creed, color, or national origin, unquote. To ensure compliance with this executive order, he established the Fair Employment Practice Committee, the FEPC, to investigate complaints of discrimination. Randolph declared victory and called off the march, promising to use his March on Washington movement as a watchdog and pressure group to make sure the government lived up to its promise. And in the ensuing years, Randolph and the March movement had their work cut out for them. The Roosevelt administration had completely ignored Randolph's demand to end discrimination in the military, and its newly created FEPC possessed few resources and even less real power to compel compliance with the executive order. black grassroots activists in and out of the March on Washington movement rallied behind the beleaguered agency, expending considerable energy in new battles to preserve the FEPC's autonomy and to prevent its dismemberment by conservative politicians who sharply disagreed with its mission. Conferences, pickets, marches, mass demonstrations in support of civil rights and the FEPC's campaign against employment and union discrimination were regular occurrences in churches, auditoriums, parks, union halls, and streets around the nation during the war. Randolph remained in the headlines, constantly berating the administration for allowing discrimination in defense industries to persist. After the war, congressional opponents of the beleaguered federal agency cut off its funding. Randolph's new counsel for a permanent FEPC held rallies, marches, lobbied Congress, but they failed to achieve their goal of extending the FEPC's life. And although individual states passed their own fairly weak anti-discrimination acts, the federal government did not. Under federal law, employment discrimination would, in effect, remain legal until the 1964 Civil Rights Act finally outlawed it. Randolph again raised the issue of segregation in the armed forces as Congress debated the Universal Military Training Act, calling for an unprecedented peacetime draft in 1948. Testifying before the Senate Armed Services Committee, the BSCP leader pledged himself to, quote, openly counsel, aid, and abet both white and Negro to quarantine any Jim Crow compulsory system. I will personally advise Negroes to refuse to fight as slaves for democracy they cannot possess and cannot enjoy, unquote. Several months later, he explained that the peacetime draft law, with no provisions against the elimination of Jim Crowism in it, will set back the cause of civil rights 100 years. He was a co-founder of the League for Nonviolent Civil Disobedience Against Military Segregation, which launched pickets in front of the White House. This is in 1948, and picketed both the Democratic and the Republican Party conventions and prepared its own campaign to encourage noncompliance with the law. For these efforts, Randolph earned considerable criticism from whites and blacks. Many whites denounced him for interfering with national security or even advocating treason. But ultimately, his efforts paid off. President Harry S. Truman needed black support for his election campaign in 1948, and to get it, he issued an executive order in mid-48 that mandated, quote, equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin, unquote. Randolph called off the civil disobedience campaign. And then there was the labor movement, its racial practices and pronouncements. From his editorship of The Messenger beginning in 1917 until his death in 1979, Randolph consistently preached a gospel of interracial unionism, of an interracial labor movement in which the exclusionary barriers and discriminatory treatment had no place at all. It was a battle he never fully won. The AFL, to which the Brotherhood had affiliated, tolerated a wide range of racial practices amongst its constituent unions. While some accepted black members and accorded them a modicum of respect and equality, many unions did not. And again, Randolph called on the AFL to ban discrimination in its ranks and to end all racial restrictions on union membership. The AFL, quote, cannot say it is democratic unless it cleans its house and says that regardless of race, color, or creed, any worker can join any AFL union, and that any union which does not have this spirit of democracy will be expelled from the Federation. This was the charge of the BSCP leader. Many white trade union officials either ignored or denounced Randolph for his continual charges of racism. Year after year, he made his eloquent plea, and year after year, the conventions of the AFL and various officials ignored him. One paper put it differently, or slightly worse. Each year, Mr. Randolph addresses the annual AFL convention in behalf of Negro workers who are being discriminated against by several of the most powerful AFL unions. This is the Black Weekly, the Michigan Chronicle. Just as regularly, the same AFL bosses take offense and accuse the Negro labor leader of insolence and arrogance, unquote. With the merger of the AFL and the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, in 1955, Randolph became one of two black vice presidents of the newly united AFL-CIO. And from that position, he persisted in the Sisyphean task, hammering away at the Federation's racist practices. As black disaffection with the AFL-CIO grew and the struggle for civil rights expanded across the South, the Federation finally adopted a weakish civil rights program at its 1961 convention that broke, at least somewhat, with past practice. And as he had done since the 1920s, Randolph continued to use his position of leadership in the House of Labor to call attention to the racial problems of organized labor and to insist upon their elimination. Until the end of his life, Randolph maintained that equality for black Americans required both civil rights and economic rights, that progress for black Americans required not only the passage and enforcement of civil rights and anti-discrimination laws, but economic policies designed to ensure the economic health of black and all Americans. Working with the new civil rights movement based in the Southern Black Church, Randolph made sure that the '63 March on Washington raised fundamental economic issues. And among the march's demands were the call not only for desegregation, but for the passage of a federal Fair Employment Practice Act, for a higher minimum wage, and for a serious public works program designed to assist the unemployed. In 1965, he went further, proposing a federal freedom budget of $180 billion to end poverty in the United States through full employment, higher incomes, medical care, and education. But by the middle of the and late 1960s, the Civil Rights Coalition had fractured, and liberalism was increasingly divided over the war in Vietnam. The elderly Randolph found himself criticized as too conservative by younger militants, whose turn to black power Randolph himself had sharply denounced. His social democratic proposals received scant attention from more conventional civil rights groups, and the labor movement to which he dedicated roughly half a century of his life only gradually became more receptive to the needs of black Americans and other minority workers, often under considerable pressure from those groups themselves. Like Randolph, Martin Luther King Jr. too found himself challenged from the left and right by 1968. And like Randolph, he too had come to insist that civil rights required economic rights and that a substantial federal commitment to income redistribution was required. In some ways, Randolph's efforts and King's fell substantially short of their goals. And yet, so much had changed. In the case of the movement's elder statesmen, a life of radicalism on behalf of black equality and the emancipation of labor had contributed centrally to something of a revolution in both labor and race relations in America. The history of the civil rights movement, perhaps the word movements, plural, is more appropriate, is a rich, long, and complicated one. And that history cannot be reduced simply to its modern phase, nor should it be reduced to its most famous figure, Dr. King. And what strikes me, and I can't resist this conclusion here, what strikes me about the recent Democratic presidential dust-up over Dr. King, President Lyndon Johnson, and the forces, whatever they are, promoting social change, is just how ahistorical the debate or the controversy was, and I'll put it bluntly, how silly the exchanges seem to me. Based on what the candidates, their surrogates, and TV commentators have said, it seems that history is pretty irrelevant. And it's as if the countless number of serious but accessible books written by scholars on King and the movement, these things don't exist. They certainly don't matter in the political arena. Listening to the coverage of the exchange almost makes me despair as a professional historian. For if something as historically momentous as the civil rights movement can be reduced to a slogan, a cliche, or ill-informed one-line exchanges, well, why bother requiring American history in our schools at all? And I don't mean to single out the Democrats on this matter, for I don't think their Republican counterparts could pass a simple multiple choice, no child left behind mandated assessment exam on civil rights history either. But perhaps that's just the nature of politics today. pithy one-liners, a gotcha mentality, and a substitution of symbolism for substance. If I shift my attention from cable news coverage back to bookshelves, I don't find myself despairing at all. To the contrary, the scholarship on the civil rights movement or movements is larger, richer, and more sophisticated than ever. And Randolph, as I hope I've made clear, is a central part of that story, a story that extends back well into the mid and early 20th century, and a movement story that embraces a very large cast of characters and organizations. To commemorate Dr. King appropriately, I would conclude, requires us not merely to put him on a pedestal, but to recognize the complexity of his dream and the movements that brought about such substantive, if limited, change to our nation. Thank you very much. Perhaps your questions, comments, critiques, observations? Please.
As far as a march being about jobs and freedom, and jobs being kind of left on the back burner historically, how would you comment on where that stands today? Because it is true that unemployment among African American population is so much higher than the white population, and also there does seem to be quite a lot of resistance among the public at large to accept this idea of economic segregation.
That's a question we could probably take the next 2 hours to begin to scratch the surface of. But let me say the following. I'm not one of those historians who mines the past for direct lessons to apply to the present. If other people want to do that, I suppose that's fine. I don't mean to enshrine either Randolph's or King's economic critique of, say, 1968 and say, see, the country didn't live up to their expectations, and look at where we are today. For a great deal has changed between 68 or the 70s, and the present. The emergence of a substantial African-American middle class, yes, the persistence of high unemployment rates, particularly among inner city and young African-American men. The causes of that unemployment and those economic problems are quite complex, and I'm not sure are entirely reducible to either King or Randolph's particular critique of 1968 before or after. But that said, yeah, it does seem to me pretty clear that from the 60s, but certainly the 1970s onward, there remains a belief that an expanding economy will lift, if not all boats, then at least a lot of them. And in the hands of conservatives, the persistence of black unemployment or black poverty rates is not the result of the economy or the American economic system, but it's the result of choices that individuals make or the culture of the people whose problems it is that we're talking about. And if only they cleaned up their act, things would be much better. The flip side of that, which I'm more sympathetic to, but I think only gets so far at the issue, is that the economy is incapable of sustaining certain levels of employment, and that economic growth naturally leaves behind large numbers of people, and jobs programs or some other kind of targeted efforts are required to address those very persistent problems. I'm more sympathetic to that perspective than I am to the conservative perspective, but with the exception of one political candidate who's not doing very well in the polls these days, the issue of poverty is simply, well, to say that it's not even high on the agenda is putting it mildly. It's almost a non-issue, certainly for Republicans and certainly for most Democrats, and alas, that is very unfortunate. Yes, in the back.
I'm curious, Randolph starting the Messenger in 1917 just kind of begs the question of connections on a more global scale of both the movements he's involved in and his own intellectual trajectory with regard to either radicalism on the part of workers or racialized anti-colonial movements and that sort of thing. Have you found any work sort of situating him globally, either intellectually or
Randolph emerges as a socialist through his exposure to and participation in an interracial, largely white, but ethnically heterogeneous left-wing radical milieu in New York City. There's stuff going on everywhere. On street corners, radical orators are speaking and addressing the issues of the time. In Harlem, Marcus Garvey is getting his start. Randolph himself is one of those speakers on the soapboxes. Randolph, Owen, and others attend radical meetings. They listen to labor leaders. They find the Socialist Party's message somewhat compelling. It's initially out of that New York milieu in which the New York Socialist Party is a bit different than the National Party in that it is more receptive to black issues, issues of racial inequality. Nationwide, this is not a high agenda item for the party, but in New York, they are receptive to that. And as a student of history and as a student of political affairs, Randolph reads about the world. He reads socialist literature, he reads foreign literature, and he absorbs it and develops a critique of what he would call American imperialism. He's certainly hostile to America's participation in an imperial war that's taking place in Europe. He becomes a member of a variety of small groups that have internationalist pretensions. Ultimately, I don't think it adds up to all that much in the World War I period. Over time, he maintains this interest, and as an AFL and then AFL CIO official, he's very interested in the larger global picture, in the developing world, in anti-colonialism. In the late 1930s through, the rest of his life, the so-called Third World is very much within his sights. He tries to use American participation in the Cold War as a lever that the United States, and many Cold War social democrats do this, that America's racial record affects negatively our country's ability to win the allegiance of, the support of the decolonizing world. The communists have a better hand in this, and Randolph, as an anti-communist, doesn't want to see that. And so they use this hypocrisy on the part of the United States to say the country needs to change. So this international vision is a very complex thing. He's certainly part of a intellectual milieu in which international issues are discussed constantly, but it really, to my mind, isn't until the late 30s onward that he really begins to do something about it and make it really quite central, beyond just writing about it and attending some meetings, making it more central to his agenda.
Could you say a little bit about the importance of Thurgood Marshall in the civil rights movement?
Thurgood Marshall and the group of African-American attorneys that are clustered around Charles Hamilton Houston, who is the dean of the Howard University Law School and then special counsel to the NAACP, were absolutely central in charting out the legal strategies that whittled away at and then knocked the legs out from under the legal edifice of Jim Crow. Marshall was the key attorney in the Brown case, but in taking on that role, he was part of an organization or a thrust that Houston himself had set into motion. There's a very interesting book by a legal scholar named Risa Goluboff called The Lost Promise of Civil Rights that just came out with Harvard University Press that looks at black attorneys and some white attorneys in the Justice Department dealing with civil rights issues and the strategies and choices that they made in the 1940s and the ways in which Marshall and the NAACP legal defense group moved away from labor-related cases, which they were dabbling in, toward school segregation cases, and what she sees as, in the title of her book, missed opportunities, lost opportunities for the movement as a whole. But it's clear that, as one of the architects, certainly as the executor of the strategy that the NAACP's legal group pursued, Marshall was one of the frontline activists, well, activist is not the right word, but one of the frontline leaders in the movement to discredit legal segregation and to dismantle it.
After the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, there was a sort of period in which a lot of the black leadership was trying to figure out what to do next and what issues to take up and how to advance equal rights and other items on their agenda. And you mentioned that in 1965, Randolph proposed a freedom budget. And I wondered, could you comment on what Randolph's attitudes were about some of the other issues that were involved during that period? For example, especially the Vietnam War, which later on Martin Luther King and earlier Bayard Rustin has said were going to be things that would prevent the kind of economic equality from being achieved that they envisioned. And also, more specifically, since Randolph lived to 79, what was his take on affirmative action as a response to the sort of labor issues, segregation in the labor market?
After the 63 march, I mean, Randolph is still the senior statesman, but his role is to convene meetings periodically, in the office that he still goes to in New York, to bring together, leaders to talk things out, to show up at the White House to receive an award or to oversee a meeting. But his day is largely past. He doesn't have a movement behind him. The Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters is a shadow of its former self. The railway industry has gone into a tailspin. The porters are generally fairly old men. Pullman Company goes belly up. The union eventually kind of merges with other unions, but its distinctive identity and power base is really quite weak by that point. So Randolph doesn't have that same institutional backing behind him. The AFL gives him some money to create the A. Philip Randolph Institute. So to a certain extent, he's a bit beholden to the AFL-CIO. The time seemed to be passing him by very quickly. He is not an outspoken opponent of the war in Vietnam. He sees that as an issue that is distracting from the economic struggle at home. Bayard Rustin, too, doesn't exactly come off very well in these particular years. And by the 1970s, Randolph is in retirement. He's, at this point in his 80s. He's living alone in New York. One gets the sense, reading the oral histories that are done with him, that he's kind of lonely. He's very grateful for people coming in with tape recorders to talk to him, but he's no longer active. So to a certain extent, the issues that emerge post-Black Power, certainly, are issues that he reads about in the paper and will occasionally comment upon if someone bothers to talk to him. But by this point, he is truly, genuinely in retirement, and he is not at the cutting edge of much of anything at this point. He does not go out in a blaze of glory, so to speak. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that yet. But a good question.
I was intrigued by his tenure in New York City and how it seemed like that was absolutely one watershed in his life. And I'm curious about this community in Harlem. Was that anchored by a black middle class at that time? Or was it just a bunch of people getting by that happened to be very intellectual and artistic?
No, Harlem was exploding in size in these years, and there were black businesses, black newspapers, so there certainly was a black middle class. There were growing numbers of Caribbean migrants who were attracted to left-wing politics. There were numerous Southern migrants to New York City. Randolph was hardly alone, who similarly found if not a home, then at least a temporary intellectual center in the Socialist Party. Some of them went on to join the Communist Party when it was formed. Others stayed in radical circles. But Randolph had a lot of company at that time. But what I'm struck with in reading the accounts of his early life, granted, much of this is filtered through his own memory, and so consciously or unconsciously, he's crafting a portrait of his youth and childhood, and we don't have much else to go on to verify this. But I am struck again and again and again that poverty was no barrier to anything in his household. Yeah. His parents worked. They worked very hard. His father was an itinerant AME minister. He didn't lick the boots of the bishops, Randolph would say. So they gave him like the worst assignments. He had to have his own business on the side to help make ends meet. But that said, it was about education, education, education. His parents, call in a neighbor to tutor the boys, Asa and James, before they go off to school. So they already know a great deal before they actually begin their formal education. They get a classical education. When Randolph gets to New York, what does he want to do? He wants to go into the theater. He wants to act. And he's attracted to what playwright? Shakespeare. So I'm trying to get a grip. At the same time, he's reading Marx. He's doing Shakespeare readings. And there's no sense of contradiction here. This is about culture, not just black culture, but culture. And Shakespeare is a part of at least his culture. His soon-to-be wife, Lucille Randolph, who was once a school teacher and now runs one of the Madam Walker beauty salons and helped support Randolph for many years while he's running around, playing the role of radical. She's into theater too. They form a local Shakespeare troupe in Harlem. They give amateur readings. He hires a voice instructor. People would later, say, the Harvard-trained Negro Philip. He never went to Harvard, but he had this Shakespearean voice that he would address crowds, so everyone thought, he went to Oxford or Harvard, but no. But the ways in which education and Shakespeare, theater, and culture were part of this milieu as much as Marx and the Socialist Party is something that truly has struck me. He loses some of that when he gets a real job, when he becomes the organizer, the chief of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and then his schedule gets really, really busy. And from that point on, he never stops. But that cultural and educational element, I keep coming back to again and again and again, and how important it is and what it seems to mean to him. Yes, in the back.
I was wondering if Jack Reed, the American journalist, had any impact upon Randolph's political ideologies and beliefs, especially upon the formation of his early beliefs and what impact other early American leaders of the Communist Party had upon him, but also the Russian Revolution itself and the subsequent Civil War.
Good question. I haven't run across the name Reed in Randolph's circles. He's not one of the ones that Randolph mentioned. I heard Elizabeth Gurley Flynn speak. I heard so-and-so speak. That's not one of the names, so I can't place him in any way, intellectually or socially, in that orbit. Debs, on the other hand, is quite central. Randolph loved Debs. And by Randolph's telling of the story, Debs loved Randolph. There was a sense of like, who are these young Negro men, who are embracing socialism? Bring them to me. Let's talk. And so they go out, they dine together. He meets Lucille Randolph, is very impressed. Both Randolphs run for public office in New York on the Socialist Party. Debs will stump for them. So there's a genuine, deep affection that is communicated both at the time in the articles that Randolph writes about Debs and in his later memories. It's just, the language is florid. He just can't express his affection deeply enough. And I think it's heartfelt. And the other group that he singles out in his recollection for impressing him and helping him and moving him towards socialism are Jewish socialists in New York. Who he will encounter as a soapbox speaker, and they'll come up to him and say, who are you? We've never seen black socialists before, and so they get to talking and they say, come look at our newspaper, you need money, we can give you money, we can help subsidize your efforts, and they do, because they're just so pleased, that here are these young black men articulating a socialist vision, and they are very supportive. So they too get singled out. The Russian Revolution, very interesting. Initially, many, not all, many socialists find this to be a cause for celebration. And in the pages of the Messenger, there's an initial euphoria about the overthrow of the Tsar and its regime and the arrival of the Bolshevik Revolution. Randolph and Owen do not join the new Communist Party. They seem fairly oblivious, as far as I can tell, from the writing at the time and the reflections at the internal theoretical disputes that take place. There are a number of black radicals in Harlem who are in the African Blood Brotherhood. They move toward the Communist Party. Randolph is just not interested in this. And he has a real sense that this is a shame. That the left is dividing amongst itself and everyone's yelling at each other in very loud voices in an acrimonious way. But he definitely stays outside of it. And as the years progress, he will watch the new Communist Party in the early 1930s. He'll watch the new black Bolsheviks in Harlem doing their work, and he doesn't like them. And there are a number of articles in the early 20s, I think 22 and certainly 23 in the Messenger, that are sarcastic and scathing in the denunciation of the black comrades who, with their talk of, and I can't imitate him, but revolution spelled R with all these little dashes, olution, and their accents and the ways in which they follow the Moscow line. And Randolph candidly says, the Russians know nothing about the American situation. So who are they to be telling the comrades what to be doing in the United States? So his frustration is clear. They repay that frustration with their own campaign of vilification against Randolph. They try to harass the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. They have nothing nice to say about him. So there's kind of a mild, well, not mild, but they fight over the course of the 1920s. They certainly think Randolph is not nearly radical enough. They bury the hatchet in 1936 when the communists proclaimed the Popular Front, and together they launched the National Negro Congress. It's often credited as being a communist innovation. It wasn't. It was very much a joint effort. Yes, they provided a lot of the legwork, but so did Randolph and his people provided a lot of legwork as well. And they break forever in 1940 at the Third National Negro Congress meeting, in which the communists have essentially taken over the organization. The anti-fascism that they have championed, for a number of years, the thing that attracted so many people to the party and its orbit, all that's gone once the Stalin-Hitler Pact is signed, and the organizers of the convention basically want to have the NNC sign on to the new party line, which is to denounce the United States' potential entry into World War II, to denounce the anti-imperialist war, to denounce Britain, France, and Franklin Roosevelt as a warmonger. And Randolph gets up and speaks and basically says, go to hell, and delivers this, I think, magnificent and powerful address in which he champions anti-fascism, now that the communists are no longer interested in it, and basically equates the Nazis and the communists as being more or less the same thing. Half the delegates walk out and boo him. The communists denounce him mercilessly, but that divorce is permanent. And from that moment onward, he will have nothing, as in nothing to do with the CP, and will do everything in his power to work against them, to denounce them, to keep them out of anything he has anything to do with. He is a very early, very active anti-communist and describes them essentially as the gravest menace to black Americans since Reconstruction. A little bit of hyperbole, but he means it.
I was just going to say, if there's one more question.
You had a question right here.
The spirit of this talk, I'd like to do a little shameless promotion. There's actually a general membership branch of the IWW that's restarted here in Missoula. We meet the first Monday of every month at the Union Club. But my question is, you probably dug into J. Edgar Hoover's archives there. I would assume he was considered Randolph was a very dangerous man.
There's a yes and no answer to that. I mean, the FBI kept a very thick file on Randolph. University Microfilms reproduced it for sale, so many university libraries have it. He was followed. They transcribed aspects of his speeches. So he was followed. But it didn't seem to affect in any way anything Randolph ever did. And by the 1940s, it gives you this sort of sense of just how poor intelligence gathering was. And you kind of think, God, they're paying these people to do what? They can't even get it right. If you're going to spy on people, at least, hire people to do it so they'll understand what they're hearing. So it's like, Randolph and the Communist Party. It's like, no, au contraire. If they want an ally in the battle against the communists, they could showcase him front and center. So when they explore the March on Washington movement, which they, spy upon, they're always concerned about the communist connection, but they don't do anything about it. Periodically, Randolph will write them to kind of correct some statement that somebody made. Later on, he writes in on behalf of others to say, their security clearance should be fine. They were as anti-communist as I was. Hoover didn't like him. In the World War II surveillance, which was quite intense, they kept a close eye on him, but they didn't seem to interfere. Not that I ever got a sense of. The people who smeared him were his comrades to the left, and it's the CP people who, ironically, not ironically, but before the Soviet Union is invaded by Nazi Germany, they denounce him for basically supporting the war chariot of FDR on Wall Street. Then, of course, there's the invasion, and then they're denouncing him for impeding the war effort. Boom, one day to the next, or almost. Takes them a few minutes to find their footing there. But for the duration of the war, they're very critical of Randolph's March on Washington movement because A, it seemed to be quite popular, and B, it's very vocal, and C, they see it as a potential obstacle to full steam ahead. They don't abandon civil rights, as some, including Randolph, had charged, but they do backpedal. They do put it on the back burner, whereas Randolph is putting it front and center. And as the war continues, their and their allies' critiques of him in the black press, say, intensify. So when he talks about civil disobedience campaigns in 1943, for example, they don't like it, and they and their allies in the black press, writing under whatever names they're writing under, are very critical of Randolph for rocking the boat, for potentially traitorous activities and the like. So it's not the FBI that's bothering him; it's the party and its allies that are doing that kind of work.
Thanks, Eric.
Thank you all very, very much.